Our South African growth figures were released today at 3.2% for the quarter. The figure is lower than expected. Now we're getting a perspective on the growth trends in other African economies, and we're joined by Wolfgang Fengler, who's the lead economist at the World Bank, joining us from our studios in Nairobi. Thank you very much, Wolfgang, for coming through. What's the GDP outlook for Kenya? We know the government is aiming for 4.5% this year. Generally, what are the trends in East Africa? Because in South Africa, the figures are less than expected, and they've been dampened by the fact that mining investments and mining output has dwindled.
Thank you, Loretta. Overall growth in East Africa has been very strong over the last years, not just this year, above 5% for most economies. Only Kenya, unfortunately, the biggest economy in East Africa, has for most of the years underperformed. And that was mainly due to domestic shocks in 2008, 2009. But this year we have projected 4.0% growth for Kenya, but that was also contingent on the constitutional referendum and also on the rains, and given both have been performing smoothly, the 4.0 is probably a conservative estimate for this year.
All right, most of the economies within the East African community are major agricultural exporters, and as you said, the sector has been susceptible to external shocks. We've seen an increase in fertilizer prices, we're seeing an increase in grain prices, speculation on the futures market. We've also seen austerity measures in Europe impacting on the ability to export. What are your projections going forward? Can these economies sustain growth above 5%?
In general, high commodity prices are good for economies which depend on agriculture and other commodities. The challenge is that the sectors, the way they're organized in many African countries, don't really benefit the population in a broad-based way. And you have a lot of domestic challenges, and Kenya is a case in point where domestic grain prices for most of last year have actually been double global prices, and global prices, as you highlighted, have been relatively high. So that's a bit the challenge. The general potential of a booming commodity sector globally and domestic challenges. For Kenya's agriculture sector, which performed extremely poorly over 2 years, minus 7.5% over the 2 years combined, 08, 09, does see a recovery now in the range of 4 to 5% this year. And that actually will help to balance growth in East Africa and in Kenya in general. But coming back to your core point on the global developments with Russia especially, the key point there is that East African economies are not as much integrated into global economies, and thus they have also been weathered by the global developments.
All right, when we look at the GDP figures in South Africa, we know that the construction sector, which contributes about 3.2% of GDP, has also seen some weaker output, which has put pressure on the GDP figure that we're seeing coming out of South Africa today. But we know that major infrastructure investments in East Africa should be fueling a burgeoning construction sector. How is it faring?
These are actually two different elements and subsectors. It is true that there has been a fueling construction sector in Kenya, and the capital have been a case in point. Construction contributes to 4% of total GDP, but the performance of the sector was one of the best, at 14%, and that was indeed almost an overheating of the sector. By contrast, broader other infrastructure are not actually at an international level, and that has actually held back the manufacturing sector among others. And so this year we do see a leveling off of construction, still a growth there, but given that agriculture is performing strongly, it's actually a good signal of a balancing out of the economy in general.
You mentioned manufacturing. For us, that was actually the silver lining in the GDP figures, because we've seen an improvement this year of 6.9%, which has added about a percentage point on the GDP number in South Africa. What are the limitations of manufacturing in East Africa, especially as we talk about a consolidated East African community, setting up of industrial development zones, trying to boost manufacturing capacity?
There are three main challenges to manufacturing in East Africa, and Kenya specifically. The first is political stability. The second is what you could broadly summarize as governance or investors' confidence. And the third is infrastructure that we touched upon. However, having said that, there is actually, like in South Africa, Kenya does see a recovery in the manufacturing sector this year, but it's recovery from a low base of the last years. And you can imagine, if you don't have reliable energy, you can't run factories, and that has been the main challenge for East Africa. In the long term though, and that relates to your other main topic on China, there is a lot of opportunity in Africa. Africa is the last low-cost frontier in the world. and it has a growing population, has growing economies of scale, and there are a lot of opportunities for Africa and East Africa specifically.
Okay, and finally and very briefly, the inflation outlook generally both within East and Southern Africa. We've seen inflation being tamed significantly, but as we're talking about a potential rise in food prices, where do you think it's going to be going forward, and what impact will it have on growth?
Basically, inflation came down quite dramatically for most of the East African countries, and from Kenya most rapidly, from 20% in 2008 to less than 5% now. So it can't go much lower indeed. But it does reinforce a broader point we often make, is the macro stability, macro policies have been quite strong in Kenya, and that's not the main concern. The main concern is micro policies and infrastructure.